Hi everyone, and welcome to History 1300. This is the first video lecture that you're going to watch, and I want to start by just explaining a little bit about what's going to happen in these, and what you should expect and what you should do with these videos. So, pretty regularly, just about every week, you're going to have at least one or two videos that you're going to have to watch as a part of your homework before you get to class. And the videos are generally going to be sort of broad, general, kind of contextual lectures about what was going on in the world at the particular time that we're going to be focusing on in class. So what I'm going to do in these videos is I'm going to just sort of talk to you about some of the things that I think are important and that factor into our understanding of immigration in the United States. Usually the videos are going to focus on things that are happening outside of the United States. So in our discussions about why immigration happens, we're going to talk about reasons for immigration that involved things happening in the United States. We're going to talk about reasons for immigration from things that are happening outside of the United States. And these videos are really going to be mostly about things happening outside the United States. What I want you to do with these videos, they're going to be pretty short, usually around 10 to 15 minutes or so. And what I want you to do with these videos is I want you to take notes. And I want you to keep track of what I say in these videos because they're going to provide really important context for what we do in class. So bring those notes to class and then you'll be ready to go to really do this sort of in-depth, detailed explorations that we'll do in our classwork. So without further ado, here's the first one. I'm going to start with a rather obvious statement. In 1400, Europeans lived in Europe. Native Americans lived in North and South America. Africans lived in Africa. In other words, the peoples of the world in 1400 were still very much disconnected, and societies were mostly regional in nature. 200 years later, though, the situation was really different. Europeans lived in Europe, North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. Africans lived in North and South America. Native American populations, while still living in the Americas, had dramatically decreased in size. So the demographics of the globe shifted in the course of 200 years. The main question of this video is why? Why did Europeans in particular begin to migrate to other continents? Why did they forcibly transport millions of Africans to the Americas as well? And how did they affect the communities of the places that they went? The short answer to all of these questions is colonialism. So the topic of this short video is why colonialism? Why did Europeans start to pursue the process of colonization in the 16th century, roughly the 16th century? Let's start by defining colonialism. Colonialism is, in brief, the policy and practice of occupying, controlling, and economically exploiting a particular region outside of the bounds of a state's metropole or central territory. It generally involves conquest and the displacement or subjugation of existing residents of the region in question. It's a process undertaken by states all over the world and since the period of antiquity. So in other words, it's not new. But in the 16th century, what we see is a process of rejuvenation of colonizations, particularly by European states throughout the world. So why did this happen? Why did the 16th and 17th century why did 16th and 17th century Europeans engage in colonialism? I like to begin this story actually in the year 1453. That's a bit of an unusual date for most students, so I want to tell you a little bit about what happened in 1453 and why it matters. Two events occurred that year that pushed the government of a few Western European monarchies to begin a process of exploration that then brought them to the New World and sort of led to colonization. The first event was the fall of the city Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Empire, as it became, originated in the area of modern-day Turkey, and in 1453 it had spread all the way up to the city of Constantinople. And after a long period of siege warfare, the Ottomans managed to actually capture the city itself. And after capturing it, they made it its capital and changed its name to what it's now known as Istanbul. Before the conquest, Constantinople was the main sort of entrepot or connecting point that connected trade networks in Asia and Europe. The most highly coveted goods in Europe including silks and various spices, came through that city before making their way to Venice and then to the rest of the European continent. So when the Ottomans captured the city, trade was dramatically affected, and trade relations between those in the East and those in the West, right, those in Europe and those in Asia, were disrupted. And the very lucrative kind of trade networks that existed before the conquest started to dissipate. The reason is because the Ottomans essentially inserted themselves into the market as middlemen and drove prices for these very lucrative goods way up. The good that sort of illustrates this best is actually pepper. So black pepper, or its Latin name is Piper nigrum, right, originated in the region of South India and Southeast Asia. So that's where it sort of comes from. It was one of the most valuable trade goods in Europe during the medieval period. Pepper was used as a common medicine. It was sort of the aspirin of its day, and was also one of the most coveted culinary items in Europe, bringing a unique flavor that was irreplaceable with European-grown goods. At the time just before the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, the price of a 100-pound barrel of pepper was on average about 42 golden ducats in Venice. Now, you don't need to know what a ducat is. It's a weight of gold. But just remember the number 42, because this is going to illustrate the effect that the Ottoman conquest had. The year after the conquest, the price of pepper skyrocketed all the way to 80 ducats a barrel. So in other words, it almost doubled in price. This dramatic increase in the price of pepper drove many European monarchs to search for other ways to obtain this and many other highly sought-after goods from Asia. So, the second event. The first event was the conquest of Constantinople and the effect it had on trade networks. The second event that occurred in 1453 was the end of the 100 Years' War. The final battle, the Battle of Castillon in July 1453, ended, you guessed it, 100 years of fighting between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. A few decades later, a similar thing occurred in the Iberian Peninsula too, when the Spanish and Portuguese armies captured the city of Granada in 1492 and ended a centuries-long war with the Kingdom of the Moors, known in Spanish history as the Reconquista. What these events had in common, and why they're relevant to the story of colonialism, is that with peace came a renewed era of state building in Europe. All those countries that had previously been fighting in long and arduous wars began investing their energy and money into other endeavors. And one of those endeavors was trade and, as we'll come to see, exploration. The first to undertake this new endeavor of exploration were the Portuguese. Under the sponsorship of Prince Henry, aka Henry the Navigator, you probably learned about him in high school, Portuguese sailors began building larger and faster ships, sponsored by the monarchy, and began sailing them south along the coast of Africa, along the western coast of Africa, in the hope of rounding the continent and reaching India themselves, thereby cutting out both the Ottoman and the Venetian middlemen that were important links to this sort of Asian-European trade. Along the way, they set up these things called fetorias, or trading military outposts all along the coast of Africa. The first was just off the coast of Mauritania, and another off the coast of Ghana by as early as 1482. A century later, by 1600, the Portuguese had over 50 of these feitoria on the western and eastern coast of Africa and South Asia. Feitoria served as trading outposts with local communities on the coasts of Africa and Asia, as well as military sort of resupplying depots. Each new feitoria allowed the Portuguese to sail further along the coast until finally, in 1498, Vasco da Gama managed to round the Cape of Good Hope and landed in India. In South India, da Gama purchased 100 pounds of pepper as one of the things that he acquired in his trip, and he purchased them for the shockingly low price of 3 ducats of gold. That's an incredible rate of return, considering the prices that pepper was going for before the conquest of Constantinople. By 1505, the Portuguese captain Lopo Soares carried back over 1 million kilograms of pepper to sell back in Europe. So in other words, by the beginning of the 16th century, the Portuguese were starting to actually bring large quantities of pepper via this new navigational trade route, right, back into Europe and selling it for tons and tons of money. So at that point, lots of European monarchies began to pay attention to the economic value of exploration. From trading with communities off the coast of Africa to importing large quantities of spices from South Asia, the economic opportunities were abundant. But the Portuguese presence off the coast of Africa made it difficult for competing kingdoms to take the same route. These feitoria served as military outposts as well, right? Blocking the way for many to sort of repeat the progress of Portuguese merchants. So as early as 1474, we know that Europeans had an idea that you could reach India by another means, by heading west. A map by the Italian cartographer Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli that you see here shows that Europeans felt that the island of Japan, aka Sipangu, you can sort of see it there in the middle, lay just a bit west of the Canary Islands. The problem was, of course, shown by the map underlaid, that it wasn't just as simple as what Toscanelli thought. There was, in fact, a continent that lay in the way. Christopher Columbus was the first to follow that path and end up stumbling upon, the Americas. Not really, of course, there were people that came before him, but in some ways he's the one that sort of initiates this process of colonization. What followed were a number of European navigators who all discovered different portions of the North and South American continents, and while they did not get direct access to the spice markets of South and Southeast Asia, they did find abundant land, pregnant with potential economic opportunities, about which we'll talk more later. So, colonialism became a way for European monarchies to increase their economic potential, either via trade or eventually via producing valuable goods on their own. European monarchs, however, were not the only ones involved in colonization. The reality is that many different types of people participated in European colonial projects in the New World. Merchants, priests, laborers, families, artisans, and soldiers all left the European continent on the transatlantic voyage to the Western Hemisphere. So the question must be, why did these people go along with colonization? In general, we can summarize the impetus for colonialism in three ways, an alliteration of three words: God, gold, and glory. Religion motivated colonization. Missionaries were among the first to explore new parts of North and South America, and their main objective was to seek out new communities and convert them to Christianity. Eventually, religion drove others to the New World for different reasons. Religious persecution, for example, pushed minority religious communities to create colonies for the purpose of safeguarding themselves and their families. Puritans, Huguenot, and Jewish communities all sought refuge in the New World. At the microeconomic level, individuals left for colonies to seek out personal fortunes. Conquistadors and soldiers helped conquer new territories in part because they got financial kickbacks for doing so. The stories of Hernan Cortez and others resounded throughout the world and illustrated how conquest could make one rich. Merchants went to corner markets and new trades and set up opportunities to participate in the great transcontinental trade networks that brought wealth and prestige to European monarchs. Laborers left simply to get out of terrible situations in their homes and seek out new opportunities for themselves and their families. And finally, personal glory motivated some to participate in colonization. Kings and queens sponsored colonization projects in part to compete with rival monarchies. The largest and most prestigious colonies allowed monarchies to claim superiority against their nemesis. And many second and third sons of nobles who were denied the ability to inherit family estates understood that the only way they could own land and make their own names was to purchase land abroad and to serve in governments in colonial societies. So, colonialism came from a basic recognition of the possibility of opportunity, be it opportunity for money, religious gain, or personal advancement. There are a few things that we can learn from this. First, colonization is the main reason that the first groups who came to America from abroad were Europeans, right? The first influx of Europeans came as a part of colonial projects sponsored by a number of different European monarchies. And second, it's important to recognize that colonization also meant the displacement and sometimes even extermination of native populations in the Americas. Colonization meant conquest, and this had dramatic impacts in the Western Hemisphere and the societies that existed there. So this will be where we start, and in class we're going to explore more what this looked like and what it meant.